Welcome back to my second video on the two-parter on canine instinct, which that's really a combination of the two words of what it is, canine and instinct. Obviously, pronunciation-wise, I'm still sticking with Caninstinct. It's not my fault, it's what it is. So, before we begin, let's address the controversy. After my release of my first chapter feedback on Caninstinct, my inbox blew up. Or I guess, not so much blew up as the author, Ben, sent me a message to correct some misconceptions that I may have been spreading, in so much that he insists that he is not a furry. So I'd like to, before we get into the review, I'd like to address that. And normally, this was where I would put my new Photoshop skills to, right here. I would have a little picture from his art gallery. But being new to YouTube, I'm fairly certain there's things you just can't show. So instead, I'm going to describe it as opposed to maybe breaking rules. So, picture, if you will, there's a man standing in front of some cell bars with his back turned the viewer. But this is no man. This is an animal. A dog, a wolf, clearly something with fur. And he's very skinny, very twinkish. And now this would normally be a normal picture. And you might think to yourself, well, this is normal when you have a story about anthropomorphic animals. There's nothing weird about having a skinny wolf sitting there. And yet, I've already established that I'm afraid to put this picture right here. Yeah. Because if you look at this picture drawn by the author, Ben, everything's pretty normal until you get to the butt region, where you have some massive, well-defined butt cheeks, which is, it's just weird. That's weird. So, it's really neither here nor there. It's not part of the story, but I'm doubling down on furry. On to the review itself. So while I love the first chapter, one of the hesitancies I had was that I was worried about reviewing the entire thing because I didn't think it could live up to that first chapter. And so over the past week, and some of the reason this video took so long to make, because I read the entire story and holy crap is it long. It's like 20 chapters, but it's also like 200,000 words. He averages something in the range of 100,000, or not 100,000 words per chapter. That would be truly insane. He averages something like 10,000 words per chapter, so it was a lot longer than I thought it would be, and it took me some work. But the verdict. Does the story live up to that first chapter? And just as an aside, this is going to be pretty much spoiler-free, so I'm not going to ruin anything. If you still want to read the book or go through the story, this should not ruin anything for you, outside of perhaps some of that initial enjoyment of discovery. That discovery when you first open up a story and find out just what it is. And as far as that goes, no. It does not live up to the first chapter. And really, how could it? That first chapter was great. I stand by that. But right away, as we hit chapters 2, 3, and 4, not only does it not hold up to the first chapter, it kind of sucks. It's not good. It's quite bad. I first had the reaction of, oh no, this is something I recommended. Which, hold on, it gets better. But essentially, the author has these huge chapters, 10,000 words plus. Like 10,000 words is where we start off for these chapters. And nothing much happens. Chapter 2, he has a conversation with a character wandering around. There's a little bit of exposition. Chapter 3, much the same way. There's perhaps a bit more of an interesting conversation then. And then it kind of goes on that way. where the amount of information that we're getting across in these early chapters could be done in 1,000 words, let alone 13,000. I actually went ahead and and pasted the manuscript to a Word document just to get the word count, because I was like, this is insanity. This is insanity. So anyway, that's how it starts. It's rough. And one of the parts I did like, though, is when we got an explanation for the first chapter. It's a very small spoiler, because essentially this is what we were told in the first chapter. This is a school. This is a school for rich and privileged animals, the best of the best. That's fine. That's interesting enough. I wasn't sure that we were told that in the first chapter. I wasn't sure whether or not to believe it. And then the other part that was interesting, we were told about that sort of fight that was framed, that was bookmarked in the first chapter. And that was presented out of order. I assumed it had something to do with the meeting there with all the other animals in the auditorium. It did not. It was sort of backstory, and it was told out of order, which I think was a really effective tool in presenting the story to have this. Because they are interconnected in so much we have motivation and how he got from point A to point B once you get that explanation. But I think it was a really good way of storytelling, which is not what we get for the rest of the story, in that it ends up being incredibly linear. And the writing also goes from pretty weighty, pretty well thought out, to pretty flat. It never gets wooden. It never gets kind of stale or boring in how it's written, but it does get a little more basic. And I know I had one of my complaints with the first chapter was that I thought the writing got a little too much, just like literally a hair, if I was giving it one critique. And I really miss that, actually, going forward and reading more of this, just because it was just not a lot there. The one place where the author does shine are the characters. For what the basic premise of the story is, and for what a lot of this is about, it's about the fact that this character is an amazing scrapper, amazing fighter. He, despite being this small little wolf, he is astoundingly strong and astoundingly able. And so having the story based around this, you would think it would be heavily combat based. You'd think there would be a lot of fights. And it's actually a lot more interesting than that. It's a lot more subtle. It's a lot more character based. The author really loves to write characters, and that's sort of where he shines. I think, and even in the early chapters where it is weak, there's at least parts there that do shine with the characters. Not always. I don't think it always hits, but sometimes you get interesting little bits. Like on the third chapter, I really enjoyed his conversation with the principal of the school, who was kind of a lunatic the way he's presented, but it was interesting. Like the writer loves characters, he loves character work, he loves conversations, and that pretty much goes on to define really what this series is about. It's not about the fighting, it's not about the world building or the writing, it's about these characters and having these conversations with characters. And as it goes on, it does improve vastly over those first few chapters. I think they do get slightly shorter. He trims it down to a degree, but then once we establish these characters, we establish the main players in the story, and that's another thing, because early on, even the characters that we are talking with, they don't play a huge role in the story. And so you get these interesting characters, you're having them fill interesting roles, and I do think it smooths out. It went from amazing at the start to a horrible nightmare that I didn't want to read, and then slowly it redeems itself. You start to enjoy it again. Not in the same way, not to the same level, but it is entertaining. Let's try and up higher this just a little bit. Yeah, it's not even a word. Because it is slower and more character-based, when we do have that action on screen, it really pops. We get a lot more impact for what we have. Because you don't necessarily need those action scenes, you don't need those big moments, but when they come along, you're like, yeah, it's exciting. Even if I am enjoying these two characters talking to each other, having these personal conflicts, you know, I do want to see the wolf punch some people, punch some animals. There's some interesting world building-ish. It's not by any means the core of the story. You don't get into a lot, but there's a little bit of snippets where you're like, oh, that's cool. When they address humans, that was the big standout to me, when there was, Because normally when you have these animal worlds, you don't have humans in it, and there are humans in this world to some capacity, but it's not like Disney, Ratatouille, where like, oh, the animals just have a separate society. It's cohesive, it's unique, and essentially humans are treated like another species of animal, which is a pretty cool take, and the way it's presented is done fairly interesting. And within those characters and those character moments, there are sort of interesting takes and interesting dynamics. I think, especially early on, the main character's sort of first friend in the school, Leo, is a very interesting character that you don't see very often. He's, it's almost like Harry Potter befriends Draco Malfoy instead of Ron and Hermione at first. And it's kind of an interesting dynamic where he's clearly kind of a jerk, but he's also almost like a debonair Han Solo-esque type where you're like, well, he's not necessarily a good guy, but he's kind of charming in his own right. So having that dynamic was really interesting at the start, and the author, for what it's worth, takes that in places where I thought was fitting. I thought that relationship made sense once you got into it and what he did with it. I'd say the story itself is played pretty straight as a character drama. It's not necessarily an action story. It's not like a romance or anything. There might be elements of those. I thought there was a strong homoerotic quality to Shiro, the main character, and that person. It's a leopard. I don't think I established that before. The leopard Leo's relationship. There's a weird push-pull there where I was like, I'm not sure if I'm reading more into it, but it's like, it's an interesting, the way it's presented is very interesting. And he has a cute little romance with a reptile who teaches him piano, and it's all understated, it's all subtle. These aren't the elements of the story, and sometimes I'm like, am I reading too much into this? But it's there, I feel like it's there. And so overall, my verdict is pretty good. Pretty good. I think it's above average once it gets going. I do think it's a monstrous hump to get over. You have to get through. It's only 3 or 4 chapters, I think, that were its struggles, but in those 3 or 4 chapters, they're written so long. When you're talking 40,000 words before it improves, like that's rough. It's interesting, because parts of it also feel like they were written at different times. I was reading in some annotations by the author himself who said this is a cleanup of an older story. It almost feels like that. It feels like he came back and wrote this banger of a first chapter, and then maybe the second and third chapter and fourth chapter might have been just touched up from that older work. Because the quality, there's differences in quality. And I feel like once you get to the newer stuff that he's writing contemporaneously, then it's pretty clearly better. So I don't know. It's a lot of guesswork, but it's interesting to look at these things and say, like, was this him 5 years ago before he had honed his craft? Because it could definitely look that way in terms of quality. I guess I should just go ahead and give this a rating. Let's give it a rating. So as opposed to perhaps normal book, hands are really weird here. As opposed to normal book, where the heck are my hands compared to that? As opposed to normal, as opposed to normal books, these. I'm gonna go ahead and rate web novels just out of 5 points, because that's normally what they do. It's out of 5 stars. And so if I ever review normal books, more professional written books, it'll be out of 10. And just keep in mind that 2 things. First off, a rating for a web novel will be highly different than a professional work. These aren't being judged nearly as harsh. It's completely free. It's made by amateurs. So a 4 out of 5, which would translate to an 8 out of 10 for a normal book. There we go. I'm getting used to it. Not even close to comparable. In terms of enjoyment, unless it's a 5-star for a web novel, it's not even comparable to a normal book. But at the same time, just in terms of how my rating scale goes, middle is average. We're not using any of this American school system crap where a C is a garbage rating. For me, I start at 2.5. 2.5 is the assumption going in, and if there's good stuff, I go above the 2.5, and if it's worse, I go below it. So 2.5 is middle of the road, completely average. And this book, Caninstinct gets a 4 out of 5 from me. I found myself enjoying it once we got through. I thought there was some really interesting character stuff done. I thought there were some really interesting characters in general. I thought there were interesting interactions, and the fact that it was slower and more subtle and less plot-driven or less sort of action-based was almost to its benefits. It's not going to be for everyone by any means, but I think it works really well if you're in it for this kind of story. And once again, huge hump. But it evens out, and you could almost just skim through those first chapters, like second chapter, just skip it, don't need it. Third chapter, just the conversation at the end. And then just skim the fourth chapter, and once you get to the fifth chapter, it starts to go. So man, I'm almost considering the 4 again. In terms of general enjoyment, this is a 4 out of 5. I think. There's nothing stellar to bring it up higher, but I do think that those early chapters being just a huge thorn in the proverbial paw here brings it down to, I'm going to say, a 3.5 for me. I think the overall quality and overall enjoyment's probably a 4, but there are severe pacing issues. And really, I would think you don't want to sit here and say like, oh, the author should do this, the author should do that. But it needs an editor. It needs someone to come back in and be like, cut all this crap, cut it all. It's way too much crap that serves no purpose, even character purpose. You have like little cute conversations, but even then, it's like, you don't need 13,000 words for this little cow secretary. It's not even an interesting character, really. It's like a bit. It's 13,000 words devoted to a bit. It's not even a funny bit. I didn't think it was funny. So anyway, that's my general take. And also talking about an editor there at the very end, I should point out that there's also some weird mistakes, especially once again in that chapters 2 and 3, which makes me think that this was perhaps part of an older draft that was moderately cleaned up and released as a whole. And that there's even a tense issue at one point where he's just kind of jumping around and some minor mistakes, and all those get cleaned up as it goes along, I think. Nothing as major as that. So I'm going to give this one a solid 3.5 out of 5. Which is, once again, I want to be clear here because I know, especially on Royal Road, people are like, anything under 4 is terrible. That's not me. That's not how I'm rating it. 3.5, still above average. That's in the good range. That's in the good, not great range for me. And I think the big caveat I have to add in is that people who are going to enjoy this, I think will really enjoy this. For whatever reason, people like weird animal stories. Like, I read the comments and stuff as I go on when I'm done, and some of the other reviews, and people who like it really like it. So I think if it's up your alley, it's up your alley. Animals at this school doing people things. And I guess as a final addendum, I should address something I said in the first chapter of feedback when I said that there's no inherent reason for these to be animals. I stand by that. I know the author disagrees. That was also in the message he sent me. But there is thematically, there are elements of why these are animals. Thematically, it makes sense from a writer's perspective, where there's themes of sort of nature and, once again, instinct, as the title might say, and these animals dealing with that, fighting who they are and fighting sort of what they naturally want to do. But there's no reason for that to require animals. You can get the same thing out of the story with humans. I still say it's absolutely flavor. It's like Zootopia. You look at Zootopia and it's like, oh, it's because they're all different species, you can talk about racism better. It's like, no, humans are racist too. Humans have natures they have to overcome and things they naturally want to do, and they're all different. So it's flavor. I stand by that. Thematically, it makes sense, and perhaps it helps highlight these themes better. But it's cute little animals running around at a boarding school. I never wanted to call it Harry Potter. It's not Harry Potter. It's completely different. but it's a, because that's what everyone thinks of, right? When they say boarding school, kids at boarding school, it's Harry Potter now. But Harry Potter specifically is structurally, it's a mystery story. People, I don't even think people realize that Harry Potter it's functionally a detective novel couched in this fantasy school environment, which maybe I should do a video about talking about that sometime, because that's something I have very strong opinions on, and there's a lot to talk about there. But anyway, all done for now. 3 out of 5, pretty good. Probably a 4 if you A, don't care about getting over a hump, or B, you're kind of into this thing, and maybe a little lower if that investment is just way too much to you, which I think for a web novel a lot of people will be, and that's a thing. So that's it. This is the deep dive on Caninstinct by Benjafine T. Next time I'm going to do a little more variety, cover a few more works at once, and that should be coming out a little sooner because I don't have to read 200,000 words. But anyway, peace.